Welcome to the Histories of Northamptonshire podcast series, and this episode number 41. Recorded on location, each episode tells the story of one of the many and varied objects which are the focus of the exhibition A History of Northamptonshire in 100 Objects. The exhibition runs at the Northampton Museum and Art Gallery between the 20th of September 2025 and February 2026. Selected by local individuals, heritage groups and the museum's own curators, each object tells a different story from the county's past. And so, to our guest for this episode. The sound of the pipes recorded, certainly not in Northampton, for this particular episode of the podcast series explaining the history of Northamptonshire in 100 Objects. I've come north of the border to Edinburgh on Princes Street, one of the most famous streets in Scotland, to talk about something which is very much of Northamptonshire. Hello, who are you and what is the object we're talking about?
Hello, my name is Alan Borthwick. I work at National Records of Scotland, where I am the head of medieval and early modern records. And what we are thinking about today is a document which is part of the Treaty of Edinburgh, Northampton, which was drawn up between March and May 1328. And the particular importance for this particular occasion is the sealed version of the confirmation by King Edward III of England, dated at Northampton in May 1328.
Why should Northampton have any part to play in this?
There were parliaments in Northampton in the reigns of Edward II, Edward III. There was one which gathered at Northampton in May 1328, at which the text of the treaty, which was to be sealed by Edward III, confirming various aspects of the negotiations which had happened at Edinburgh, was written up and sealed by him, and a copy of that version of the document was sent north to Edinburgh to be retained by Robert Bruce, King of Scots.
This treaty brought to an end a war.
That's right, yes. The history of England and Scotland in late 13th century, early 14th century is extremely complicated. A lot of battles but it was actually not just physical battles, it was a war of words between a succession of Scottish kings and also, to a degree, a succession of English kings. In particular, for England, Edward's first, second and then third. In Scotland, after the death of Alexander III, 1286, John Balliol, Robert Bruce. It's a fascinating period, and I often think that over that 40 or so year period of the first Scottish War of Independence, there was so much going on, and interestingly, it has left an enormous amount of written record, and it's this particular document which is very much a part of that, because it seems to bring to an end that first period of the conflict between England and Scotland.
Clearly we're talking about international relations, and there's a fascinating parallel to the modern day. Indeed, it is a debate that is going on, and one which we don't perhaps need to delve into in too much detail right here. What did the treaty achieve beyond presumably saving lives?
One of the big things, certainly for the Scots, was to ensure that English kings recognised that there was a rightful King of Scots who was accepted as King of Scotland. There had been the major difficulty for the Scots over the previous 40 years had been the reluctance of Edward I, Edward II, to accept that there was an independent Scottish king. It stemmed really from the premature death of Alexander III, 1286, the sudden death of his heir, an infant granddaughter, 1290. Edward I was invited to adjudge between a series of contenders for the vacant Scottish throne, and that ended up with the coronation of John Balliol, 1292, who was approved as king by Edward I. This was part of Edward's first assumption that he had the right of overlordship over Scotland. Not all Scots agreed. Some, I think, might have perhaps just thought, well, we'll accept that, but not all did. Big problems then arose for the Scots from 1292 onwards, when it was obvious that Edward I was not terribly happy with what Balliol was doing as king. He invaded Scotland in 1296, forced Balliol to resign his throne. And then there was a period when there was, as far as the Scots were concerned, no Scottish king. But as far as Edward I was concerned, he was the effective overlord of not a kingdom, but a land. He, in effect, decided that he was the superior lord of Scotland, but it wasn't a kingdom anymore.
So how far did the treaty bring turmoil to an end? Or did it, in fact, catalyse more of the same?
Well, yeah, this was the big problem. And I think the problem possibly was the fact that in the late 1320s, Robert Bruce, Robert I, who had seized the throne in effect of Scotland, 1306, by the late 1320s he was getting seriously ill. He died 1329. It was he who had made sure that the principle of the independence of the Scottish kingdom had been kept alive over many, many years. Particularly, perhaps, if you like, you think about the Battle of Bannockburn 1314, but there was a continuing struggle even after that terrific victory for the Scots over the English at Bannockburn. Even that didn't persuade Edward II that he should accept Bruce as king. It also then began to get quite messy with the papacy, who had a very significant role in international diplomacy at that point, and Edward II was encouraging the Pope not to recognise Robert Bruce as the King of Scots. Lots of very interesting documents addressed by the Pope to Robert Bruce. For example, I can't remember the exact terms, but something like, the fact that we haven't called you king doesn't necessarily mean to say that you aren't king. Well, we're not calling you the king. And there were these sorts of very tortuous little bits of phraseology, getting round the fact that the Pope persuaded by Edward II that he should not call Robert I King of Scots. Therefore, very careful not to call him king, because that would have accepted Bruce as independent king.
This treaty was, I believe, written in Northampton. We are in a city of castles, or at least a city dominated by a castle which is within almost spitting distance of where we are sitting right now. We don't have the castle in Northampton anymore. Who wrote the terms of the treaty? Was it a negotiated thing? Because it's not as though you can get on the phone to do this. We're talking about an event that took place 700 years ago. So who set the terms, and what negotiation was required to establish them?
Yeah, as far as we know, there really were a lot of negotiations. It first started probably in late 1327, when Robert Bruce sent a document to the King of England, Edward III, by that stage, setting out the likely terms in which he would accept a final perpetual peace. Interesting set of conditions, one of which obviously the main one would have been accepting him as King of Scots, independent King of Scots, and Edward III agreeing that he had no right of superiority over Scotland. But there were very other conditions, one of which was the marriage of Robert I's infant son, David, to Edward III's sister, Joan. Though they were both very young. David Bruce, Robert's son, was only 4 at that stage, having been born 1324. But the various negotiations like this took place, first of all, in York in early 1328, and thereafter in Edinburgh in March 1328. And it was in Edinburgh in March 1328 that the final version of the treaty was sealed by English envoys and by Robert I. And then that version of the treaty, which had been sealed in Edinburgh, was sent to Edward III for him to apply his own great seal, his assent to the document. It had been agreed by his envoys on his behalf, but the confirmation of the treaty by Edward III at Northampton in May 1328 finally sealed, as far as the English were concerned, the fact that this treaty was now final.
It's fascinating you should say that, Alan, because in modern times, that negotiation timeline, you're talking about a few months. Now, we would talk in terms of years. So actually, they got things done, relatively speaking, quite quickly. You mentioned terms. There was a financial one as well.
That's right, yes. So one of the remarkable things, I think, is the fact that Robert the Bruce committed Scotland to pay £20,000 over 3 years to settle any outstanding claims, which, well, there are views about whether this was recompense for the very large number of raids that Scots troops had made, in particular in the north of England, over the previous 15, 16 years. So if we just assume that £20,000 was some sort of compensation, and £20,000 nowadays may not sound very much, it is very difficult to work out what a sum of money in 1328 might be in modern terms. One figure which I've seen says that it might be around about £20 million now, £25 million. That doesn't sound very much, but perhaps the interesting thing is that if we think about what was, as far as we know, the standard crown revenue in Scotland, the crown income in Scotland in the 1320s. Well, estimates might be round about somewhere between £4,000 and £10,000. So £20,000 suddenly becomes a massive amount.
Who would have ended up paying that? That's quite a burden to shoulder.
Yeah. In 1326, Robert I was able to persuade his parliament that a degree of taxation should be accepted, and so money began to come in from the royal boroughs in Scotland. In addition, the Crown in Scotland had its own revenues from customs, exports on wool and skins and the like, and also revenue from its own Crown lands. Together, the Scots hoped that they were going to be able to gather enough money to pay for this £20,000. They struggled a little bit. I think they managed to delay the first year's payment, but the money was actually paid over a period of 3 years, which is what had been hoped for. Remarkably, though, there was a document which was part of the overall negotiation, which was agreed, but which never came into effect. And in this document, it said that if the marriage, which was in the treaty between David Bruce, Robert's son, and Edward III's sister Joan, if that marriage did not occur, or was not fully consummated, then the Scots would be obliged to pay a penalty of no less than £100,000. Now that is a massive amount of money, and I have no idea how it is that the Scots would ever have paid it. It might be this is part of the English envoy's hopes that it was such a massive amount that the Scots would realise that this was deadly serious.
That's quite a sting in the tail. Alan, you come from north of the border. Mm-hmm. Northamptonshire's involvement in the Treaty of Edinburgh may be incidental, but for us in Northamptonshire, it is quite fundamental. Given the parallels towards independence of Scotland from England at the moment, which I'm not going to ask you to comment on, what relevance to the Scots does this treaty, which is now part of the exhibition, what does it have for modern-day Scots? Is it a prized document? Do people take notice of the document, or is it just one of those things that is now part of the history of Scotland and Northamptonshire?
It's difficult to give just one answer to that. I mean, I would say that it brings to an end, as we see it now, this is obviously in retrospect, the first stage of the Scottish War of Independence. Unfortunately, it was not the final and perpetual peace that it had been hoped it would be. Within a couple of years, the Scots and the English were fighting once again, unfortunately, and that was probably in part because Robert I had died, and he was succeeded by the infant David, his son, who at the time of his succession was only 5. He had a regent. The big problem, though, for the Scots was that there was the possibility of a rival claimant to the Scottish throne in the person of Edward Balliol, who, with Edward III's encouragement, was able to invade Scotland, seize the throne, having beaten the Scottish army in 1332, and then it all just broke out once again. So it may seem, in retrospect, that this is just another document. But if you look at it from the point of view of Robert I, 1327, 1328, he had achieved what he really wanted, and that was his acceptance by Edward III of Scotland as being an independent kingdom of which he was its rightful king, and that was what he had been arguing for, more or less right from when he became king, 1306. And for the Scots, that was a massive achievement, and therefore this document represents a really important part of the history of not just Scotland, but also of England in the early 14th century.
It is a fascinating story. As one who was born in Northampton, to my eternal shame, I had no idea that we had an involvement in a document of such pivotal importance, as you say, to the Scots and to the English as well. This exhibition is about the histories of Northamptonshire, and it's an amazing exhibit to have for us in Northampton. As a Scot, can you put into words for me what this document says for Northamptonshire and Northamptonshire's involvement in its creation?
There were parliaments happening in Northampton itself in reign of Edward II and also in reign of Edward III. They were not only happening in Westminster. It's quite an interesting concept that the Parliament wasn't obviously at that point in one fixed place. And I think in particular in the late 1320s, because of the vulnerable position that King Edward II was in. His administration of the realm fell into the hands of others, his Queen Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer. And it meant, therefore, that perhaps the way that affairs were being conducted wasn't necessarily just being dominated by, if you like, the usual suspects, because there were elements of the baronage who were supporting one faction, they might also support another. And Edward III was a minor himself. I think he was 14 when he came to the throne after the overthrow of his father. Very difficult period, really. And the barons were summoned to Parliament at Northampton, 1328, to view the treaty. Edward III was able to assent to it. Unfortunately, there are views, it's clear from English chronicles, that perhaps Edward III was not terribly keen on some of the terms of the treaty, and that may have coloured his approach within a couple of years.
Alan, I've said this on quite a number of the podcasts making up the Histories of Northamptonshire. That is truly a fascinating story, and I have to say, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but outside this building, right now, in Princes Street, is somebody playing on the bagpipes, I think, Scotland the Brave, which has got to be one of the best ways to bring this particular episode of the exhibition to a close. Thank you so much for taking the time to tell us the story today.
Thank you very much. Very happy to meet you here.
Thank you for listening to this Histories of Northamptonshire podcast. If you would like to find out more about the objects or listen to other episodes in the series, go to www.northamptonmuseums.com. Alternatively, you can visit the Northampton Museum and Art Gallery, where you can see the A History of Northamptonshire in 100 Objects exhibition for yourself. The Histories of Northamptonshire project is funded by Arts Council England as part of the National Portfolio Programme.